Well, Shell Canada was one of the energy companies making presentations to lawmakers in Ottawa this week about the state of the industry and the kind of aid that it might be needing in the future. We are now welcoming Michael Crothers with us, who is the Shell Canada's president and country chair, who was there. And Michael, thank you very much for being with us. And I guess I'd like to start with your message to Parliament and what you think might come of it.
Well, thanks, Amanda. Well, really, the broad message is let's continue with this enormously collaborative approach that we've had through the COVID-19 crisis and sustain that in a way that helps us to break through some of the difficult issues we've been trying to manage as a country to balance the environment and the energy sector. There's been so much focus on unity, on joint decision-making, and on focus on what really matters to Canadians. I think that if we continue that mode of working and way of working together, that it can make a huge difference for our ability to make the kind of decisions we need to make, not only to protect our environment, but to keep our sector thriving as it continues to drive down emissions.
Do you feel as though there's been a mixed message on support for the sector? Michael, we never did, although there was a suggestion very early on that there would be specific aid for energy. It never came. When there was aid that could be applied to the sector, it kind of came with strings attached that felt a little bit backhanded. Is there a kind of a mixed feeling in Ottawa about supporting the energy sector?
Well, I can say from the industry's perspective that there's been some measures that have been very helpful, and they've gotten people to work, or will get people to back to work right away. So the Orphan Wells support, the methane fund to help us continue with driving down emissions, and the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy have all been immediately helpful. I'd say what still needs work is to understand just how the loan provisions and liquidity provisions the government is putting in place will work. The so-called LEAF program for large-scale support, and also the one for smaller businesses. There still seems to be a lot of difficulty just understanding how those programs can be implemented. And I think that's where maybe it's just a bit of catch-up. How can the government just catch up with this enormous workload they've had to help smaller companies understand how they can tackle and access some of those facilities? I mean, the challenge is massive, especially for the small oil-weighted producers. Their liquidity is in such jeopardy. They really do need that support. So I think the intent is there. It's more about how the details of those programs and how they can be implemented.
We have seen this obviously collapse in the price of oil, and there's a modest recovery here, but it's certainly nothing close to what many need it to be. How is Shell Canada coping with that?
Well, like our peers, it's been a really rough ride. You can see that our group has decided to cut our dividend for the first time since the Second World War. So, a very tough decision, but a really necessary one to keep us in control of our destiny and our balance sheet flexibility. We've also eliminated bonuses, which will affect all staff, particularly executives, 30 to 50% of the executive pay. These are necessary things to do. Focused on our supply chains, how we can work with our suppliers to reduce cost, eliminating, if we can, contract support, and trying to preserve jobs. So we've been able to keep our folks working, which is key. Our teams have done an enormous job, just fantastic job of balancing the demand destruction, keeping our frontline facilities working, and keeping people safe. So I'm pleased to say that we've only had 2 illnesses across our 3,700 workforce. They were personally related and quick recovery, so everyone's well and safe. And right through the retail front line in our 1,400 stations, I mean, the teams have done just an incredible job of keeping the energy flowing to Canadians at a really difficult time. Now, so we're looking forward, though, as well, thinking, how can we continue our priority around reducing our emissions and shifting our energy mix in Canada? How can Shell continue its investment in new energies and cleaner energies, which we've made a huge commitment to? You may have noticed just last month the commitment to net zero by 2050. And we're investing a lot, and a lot of that is in Canada. And I hope we can continue to grow our opportunities here, working with governments and other parts of the industry to find ways, as I said, to bridge this challenge on continuing to drive our emissions down, but letting the oil and gas sector thrive while it does that and be an engine for prosperity as it's always been, providing funding to help Canada shift towards a cleaner energy mix over time.
Michael, as well as the self-inflicted wounds that the country has imposed on the energy sector, including locking in our resource, not having enough pipelines to get it out, we have seen more recently outside investors shunning the group. So the Norwegian Oil Fund, of course, most recently publicly disavowing some of the biggest names in the oil sands. How do you kind of keep a positive attitude about investing in Canada when there's so much negative sentiment around it?
That's a great question. I think we have to be really listening to our investors, and they have a very high expectation of us. Society expects us to be aligned with the goals of society, and I do believe the Canadian oil and gas sector is. I'll take LNG Canada as an example. There's an opportunity that Shell's the lead investor in. It's 10,000 jobs in BC. It's $2 billion local BC investment, and of that, $1.3 billion is Indigenous contracts, Indigenous companies. And the value of it links to this massive resource that Canadians have figured out how to produce very competitively, and enormously positive relationships with First Nations people, albeit not unanimous support, but from end to end, tremendous relationships that have been very well built and sustain it. And I think the other key point is that gas that we can bring from Port St. John area, the Montney, has half the average carbon intensity of any LNG in the world. And that's going to keep that resource flowing in a way that I think Canadians should really be proud of. It's the lowest carbon intensity gas. It's going to get to Asia and displace coal and help with their air quality. And it's going to sustain jobs in Canada for generations to come.
All right, we'll leave it there, Michael. We appreciate your time today. Thanks for being with us. Michael Crothers is Shell Canada's president and country chair.